The building was a monolith in the middle of the city, its glass facade gleaming in the moonlight like a beacon for insomniacs. Evan liked his job as the night security guard here: easy work, good pay, and a view from the 57th floor that made him feel like he owned the city. It was quiet now, the kind of stillness only skyscrapers knew. The cleaning crew had left hours ago, leaving Evan alone to patrol the labyrinth of hallways. He glanced at the bank of monitors in the security office. Each screen displayed a grainy black and white feed of the building's various floors. Nothing moved, save for the occasional flicker of static, a common glitch he'd reported more times than he could count. Just another quiet night, he muttered, sipping lukewarm coffee from his thermos. At 2:37 a.m., his phone buzzed with a maintenance alert: elevator C, service required. Evan groaned. Maintenance wasn't his job, but he was expected to check on anything unusual. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The elevator sat idle, its silver doors slightly ajar. A faint mechanical hum whispered from inside. "Great," Evan muttered. He jammed the close door button, but nothing happened. The panel lights flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw a strange symbol flash on the display before it reverted to the usual floor numbers. Evan stepped inside, rolling his eyes. "You better not trap me in here," he said aloud. The doors slid shut with a soft whoosh. As the car began to descend, the floor numbers on the display ticked down. 57. 56. 55. A sudden jolt threw him against the side panel. The elevator groaned like a living thing, and the display blinked out. He fumbled for the emergency stop button, but the car continued to descend, slower now, deliberate, as though something unseen were controlling it. When the doors opened, Evan expected to see one of the lower office floors. Instead, he was greeted by an unfamiliar sight: a dim corridor stretching endlessly into shadow. The walls were stained with something dark and wet, and a single, flickering fluorescent light dangled precariously from the ceiling. "This isn't right," he whispered, stepping back. The doors began to close, but before they shut completely, he saw something move at the far end of the corridor. A figure. No, figures, several of them, shrouded in shadow, their limbs impossibly long. The elevator jerked, and the doors sealed him inside once more. The car resumed its descent, faster now, hurtling downward without regard for the building's structure. The display flickered back to life. Instead of floor numbers, symbols he didn't recognize scrolled past, twisting and rearranging themselves like a language trying to be born. Evan's heart pounded. He jammed every button on the control panel, but the elevator didn't stop. His radio buzzed with static, punctuated by faint whispers he couldn't understand. When the car finally stopped, the doors opened to reveal another alien floor. This one was bathed in red light, the air thick and oppressive. In the distance, he heard someone, whispering his name. Evan. He stepped back, gripping the railing. "This can't be happening," he said, his voice trembling. But as the doors began to close again, a pale hand shot through the gap, stopping them. And then, they opened wide. The hand that stopped the doors was pale, skeletal, with fingers too long and knobby to be human. Evan stumbled back, clutching at the railing as the doors slowly opened, revealing the figure attached to it. The thing stepped into the elevator. It was draped in a tattered suit, the fabric sagging like it had been underwater for decades. Its face was pale and gaunt, the skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth, too wide, with cracked lips, curved into a sick imitation of a smile. "Evan," it rasped, its voice a low whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "Going down?" Evan's legs threatened to buckle, but he forced himself to stand his ground. What are you?" he managed, his voice a cracked whisper. His hand fumbled for the emergency phone embedded in the panel, but when he yanked it open, the cradle was empty. The static on his radio grew louder, drowning out the whispers. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "You asked for this," it said, stepping closer. didn't you?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Evan stammered, his back pressed against the wall. "Just let me out." The figure chuckled, the sound dry and hollow. "Out?" It gestured toward the glowing display above the doors. The symbols continued to shift and morph, glowing faintly in the dim light. "There is no out. Only down." The elevator shuddered and began to move again, descending with a stomach-lurching speed that made Evan's ears pop. He felt weightless for a moment, and then the car stabilized, the lights flickering madly. The figure stood perfectly still, unbothered by the violent motion. When the elevator stopped, the figure pointed toward the doors. "Perhaps this will help you understand." The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The floor outside was a warped mockery of the lobby he had walked through earlier. The walls were cracked, oozing with some dark, viscous fluid. The reception desk was overturned, papers scattered across the floor, all of them blank. And the air, it felt heavy, thick, as though the space itself was breathing. "No," Evan muttered. "This isn't real." He stepped toward the doors, desperate to escape the confines of the elevator. But the moment his foot touched the threshold, the shadows in the room began to move. Shapes emerged from the darkness, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. Evan stumbled back into the elevator, and the doors slammed shut. "You can't run forever," the figure said, its voice dripping with amusement. "Sooner or later, you'll have to face what's waiting." The elevator jolted, and the lights flickered, plunging the car into complete darkness. Evan's breathing was ragged, his pulse hammering in his ears. When the light returned, the figure was gone, but the faint sound of laughter lingered in the air. Desperate, Evan reached for the control panel and began mashing buttons at random. The elevator responded with an agonized groan, and then it began to rise, slowly at first, then faster, as though something were chasing it. Floor after floor flashed past the narrow window, but none of them looked familiar. Some floors were empty, others flickered with dim light, and a few revealed fleeting glimpses of things moving just out of sight. On one floor, he saw what looked like a room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting something that wasn't there. As the elevator climbed, the temperature began to rise. Sweat beaded on Evan's forehead, and the air grew thick and stifling. The symbols on the display shifted again, forming shapes that resembled eyes, all of them staring directly at him. The elevator stopped abruptly, the force throwing Evan to the ground. The doors creaked open to reveal another bizarre floor. This one was covered in deep, black water that reflected the faint light from the elevator. In the distance, Evan saw a figure sitting in a chair, its back to him. The figure moved slightly, as if it had heard him. Evan didn't want to leave the elevator, but something in the back of his mind whispered that he had to. That this was the key. "I have to get out of here," he muttered, stepping forward. The water was cold and ankle-deep, sending a shiver through him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the water were clinging to him, pulling him down. The figure in the chair didn't move again, but Evan could feel its attention, a suffocating presence pressing against his chest. As he reached the chair, he raised a trembling hand and placed it on the backrest. "Who are you?" he whispered. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that sent a bolt of ice down Evan's spine. It was his own. The doppelganger grinned, its mouth stretching far too wide. "You're not ready," it said in a voice identical to his own. The lights in the elevator flickered violently, and the walls began to groan, as though the building itself were alive. Evan turned to run, but the floor gave way beneath him, plunging him into darkness. The darkness swallowed Evan whole. He clawed at the air, flailing for something, anything, to anchor himself. His lungs felt constricted, as though the weight of the void was crushing the air out of him. For a moment, there was no sound, no light, nothing but the oppressive, endless blackness. Then, with a sickening lurch, he slammed into the floor of the elevator. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, and he lay sprawled on the cold metal, gasping and trembling. The overhead light flickered on, casting dim, yellowish light over the walls. The elevator was different now. The pristine metal panels were gone, replaced by corroded, rust-streaked walls. The air was damp and carried a faint stench of rot. The control panel had warped, its buttons cracked and oozing a thick, dark substance. Evan staggered to his feet, his limbs shaky and weak. He pressed the emergency button, but it sunk into the panel with a squelch, leaving a sticky residue on his finger. "No, no, no," he muttered, wiping his hand on his pants. His voice echoed unnaturally in the confined space, like the walls were mocking him. The elevator groaned and jolted, shaking violently. Then it began to rise, slowly at first, but with an unnatural rhythm, as though being pulled by uneven, massive chains. The overhead light dimmed further, and the tiny window in the door revealed only a flickering, crimson glow outside. Evan's heartbeat thundered in his chest. He pressed his face to the glass, squinting to make sense of what he was seeing. Outside, the elevator shaft seemed to have been replaced by a vast, vertical expanse of red-lit mist. Shapes flitted through the fog, shadows too large and grotesque to comprehend. Some crawled, others hovered, their indistinct forms flickering like broken images on a faulty screen. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The elevator stopped abruptly, nearly sending him to his knees. The doors slid open, revealing a new floor. Evan hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. The corridor beyond was lined with dozens of doors, each one slightly ajar. The walls were cracked and stained with what looked like black tar, and the flickering light fixtures overhead cast jagged shadows across the floor. Faint whispers echoed through the hallway, their source unseen. Evan gripped the edge of the doorway, reluctant to leave the relative safety of the elevator. But something in the corridor drew him forward, an invisible force tugging at his mind. "Maybe there's a way out," he muttered, trying to convince himself. "Maybe this is it." As he stepped into the hallway, the elevator doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. He spun around and pounded on the doors, but they didn't budge. "Come on," he shouted, panic rising in his voice. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, seeping into his ears like tendrils of smoke. He turned back toward the corridor, his eyes darting between the doors. Each one opened just wide enough to reveal the edge of something, a sliver of movement, a glint of light, a faint outline of a figure. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Evan took a cautious step forward, his shoes sticking slightly to the tar-like substance on the floor. The air grew colder with every step, and his breath came out in visible puffs. As he approached one of the doors, it creaked open wider. He froze, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something compelled him to look inside. The room beyond was small and windowless, illuminated by a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. At the center of the room stood a chair. Sitting in the chair was a figure, its back turned to him. "Hey!" Evan called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. He stepped closer, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. The figure was slumped forward, its head hanging low. It wore the same uniform as him, right down to the security badge clipped to its chest. Who are you?" Evan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure twitched. Slowly, it began to turn its head. Evan's breath caught in his throat as the face came into view. It was his own face, but twisted and wrong. The eyes were sunken and black, the skin pale and stretched tight over the skull. The doppelganger grinned, its mouth splitting open far wider than any human should. "You don't belong here," it rasped in a voice that was a distorted echo of his own. Evan stumbled back, his mind racing. He turned to run, but the corridor had changed. The walls were closer now, pressing in on him, and the doors were gone, replaced by featureless, cracked concrete. "No, no, no," he screamed, running blindly down the hallway. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't dare look back. The hallway seemed endless, stretching on and on until his legs burned and his lungs felt ready to burst. Just when he thought he couldn't run any further, he saw it, a single door at the end of the corridor. It was different from the others, sleek, metallic, and unblemished by the decay that plagued the rest of the building. A faint, golden light seeped through its edges. Desperate, Evan sprinted toward the door, throwing his full weight against it. It swung open, and he stumbled inside, collapsing to his knees. The room was vast and empty, its walls made of polished glass that reflected his exhausted form. The golden light came from above, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. But the relief was short-lived. In the reflections, Evan saw them. Figures standing just behind him, their hollow eyes fixed on his trembling form. And then, they began to move. Evan's breath hitched as he turned, half expecting to see nothing behind him. But they were there. The figures were tall and skeletal, their limbs impossibly long and spindly. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, like embers buried in ash, and their faces were grotesque imitations of human features, no two alike. One had no mouth, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin where it should have been. Another grinned with rows of needle-like teeth that stretched far beyond its jaw. They stood motionless, their hollow gazes locked on Evan. Instinctively, he stumbled backward, his palms scraping against the cold, reflective surface of the glass walls. The golden light above flickered, and the room seemed to grow smaller, the walls inching closer as though they were alive. "Stay back," Evan choked out, his voice trembling. "I don't know what you want, but stay back." The figures tilted their heads in eerie unison, as if mocking his plea. Then, slowly, they began to move, their steps unnervingly fluid, like predators stalking prey. Evan's gaze darted around the room, searching for an exit. There was none. Just the endless glass walls, his distorted reflection trapped within them. But as his eyes swept the mirrored surface, something caught his attention. In the reflection, the room wasn't empty. The walls were the same, the figures were the same, but the floor, no longer smooth and glass-like, was covered in a sprawling, blackened spiral etched deep into the surface. Evan looked down, but the floor beneath his feet was smooth and featureless. What is this?" he whispered. The figures stopped, their movements halting as though they, too, were waiting for something. In the reflection, the spiral began to shift, its black lines writhing like living things. At its center, a dark void yawned open, an abyss that pulsed like a heartbeat. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, its words indecipherable but resonating deep in Evan's chest. The figures turned their attention to the spiral in the reflection, their hollow eyes gleaming with something that almost resembled reverence. Evan could feel it, too, the pull of the void. It wasn't just a presence, it was a hunger, vast and unrelenting, and it wanted him. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not going near that thing." But the pull grew stronger, tugging at his very core. The golden light above flickered wildly, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The figures began to move again, this time circling him, their skeletal forms closing the distance with deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. "Stop!" Evan screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the guttural whisper, which grew louder, more insistent. In the reflection, one of the figures stepped into the void, its body dissolving into shadow as it was consumed. The others followed, their forms melting into the spiral like ink spreading through water. Evan's heart pounded as he watched the last figure step into the void. Then, slowly, its hollow eyes turned to him, beckoning. "No," he said again, his voice breaking. "I'm not going in there." The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. For a moment, everything was still. Then the void in the reflection exploded outward, its black tendrils crashing through the glass like waves. Evan threw up his arms, but the shards passed through him harmlessly, dissolving into the air. When he lowered his hands, the room had changed again. The glass walls were gone, replaced by crumbling stone covered in moss and slime. The golden light had dimmed, replaced by a sickly, greenish glow emanating from the spiral, now etched into the floor at his feet. The figures were gone, but their absence was far from comforting. The oppressive weight of the void was stronger now, pressing against Evan's mind, threatening to crush him under its weight. A sound broke the silence, a faint ding, like an elevator arriving at its floor. Evan spun around to find an elevator door embedded in the far wall. It was old and rusted, its surface covered in strange, shifting symbols that glowed faintly in the green light. Desperate for escape, he sprinted toward it. The doors creaked open as he approached, revealing a pitch-black interior. "This is it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This has to lead out of here." But as he stepped closer, he hesitated. The darkness inside the elevator wasn't normal, it was absolute, an abyss that seemed to swallow the faint green light around it. Behind him, the spiral began to pulse, its lines glowing brighter with each beat. The whisper returned, louder and more insistent, echoing through the chamber. Evan glanced back at the spiral, then at the elevator. His instinct screamed at him to run, but where? There was no way out. "I don't have a choice," he muttered, stepping into the elevator. The doors slammed shut behind him, plunging him into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the elevator jolted violently, sending Evan crashing into the wall. The car began to move, but this time, it wasn't going up or down, it felt like it was moving sideways, accelerating faster and faster. The walls groaned and creaked, and the temperature dropped sharply. Evan's breath came out in ragged gasps, his fingers clawing at the walls for stability. The whisper was louder now, deafening, its words still incomprehensible but filled with a dreadful urgency. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the elevator stopped. The doors creaked open, revealing a scene that made Evan's stomach turn. The floor outside was covered in bodies, their faces twisted in agony. Some were old and decayed, their flesh sloughing off in strips, while others were fresh, their eyes wide and glassy. In the distance, he saw it, a massive structure rising from the carnage, its surface covered in the same shifting symbols as the elevator. At its peak, a figure stood waiting, its form cloaked in shadow. The whisper ceased, replaced by a single word that echoed through the void, spoken in a voice that was not his own. "Come." Evan hesitated on the threshold of the elevator, staring out at the grotesque expanse before him. The bodies stretched as far as he could see, a sea of twisted forms piled one upon the other. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the faint, wet sounds of movement echoed in the distance, as though something unseen crawled through the carnage. At the center of it all stood the towering structure, an impossible amalgamation of stone, metal, and pulsing black veins that writhed like living things. The shifting symbols etched into its surface glowed faintly, their patterns hypnotic and maddening. And at its peak, the shadowed figure stood waiting. The single word still echoed in Evan's mind, "Come." He wanted to retreat back into the elevator, to slam the doors shut and hope against hope that it would carry him back to the normalcy of his life. But the elevator refused to respond. The moment his foot touched the floor outside, the doors closed with a metallic clang and disappeared, leaving only the unbroken expanse of bodies behind him. A shiver ran through his body as he stepped forward, the soles of his shoes sinking slightly into the yielding, flesh-like terrain. His every step was accompanied by a sickening squelch, and he tried not to look down at the faces staring blankly up at him, their mouths frozen in silent screams. "What do you want from me?" Evan shouted, his voice hoarse and raw. The figure at the peak of the structure didn't respond. It stood perfectly still, a silhouette against the pulsing greenish light that radiated from the structure's core. The whisper returned, rising like a tide in his mind. The words were still unintelligible, but their intent was clear: keep moving. Evan obeyed, his feet dragging as he trudged through the grotesque landscape. The closer he got to the structure, the more oppressive the air became, pressing against him like an invisible weight. His chest tightened, and his limbs felt heavier with every step. As he reached the base of the structure, he saw that it wasn't solid. The surface writhed and shifted, opening and closing like the mouth of a great, breathing beast. A jagged staircase spiraled upward, its steps slick with a dark, viscous fluid that seemed to pulse in time with the whisper. Evan placed a trembling hand on the first step, and the surface immediately reacted, the symbols glowing brighter beneath his touch. The whisper grew louder, clearer now, forming fragmented words that clawed at the edges of his understanding. Climb, ascend, claim. He didn't want to obey, but something compelled him to move. As he climbed, the structure seemed to change around him. The staircase twisted and warped, the steps elongating and narrowing, as if trying to throw him off. The walls closed in, then expanded outward into infinite voids. The bodies outside the structure were visible through occasional gaps, their blank eyes following his ascent. Some of them twitched, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. "What are you?" Evan muttered, his voice trembling. "Why me?" The whisper didn't answer, but as he climbed higher, the words began to solidify. Fragments of sentences echoed in his mind, overlapping and disjointed. "You called us, the descent is eternal, you are the key." Evan's legs burned, his muscles screaming in protest. He didn't know how long he had been climbing, the concept of time had lost all meaning in this place. But finally, he reached the peak, the staircase opening onto a flat, circular platform. The shadowed figure stood at its center, waiting. Up close, it was even more unsettling. Its form was indistinct, shifting and flickering like a poorly tuned signal. One moment, it seemed human, its face obscured by a hood of pure shadow. The next, it was monstrous, its body elongating and twisting into impossible shapes. "You," Evan began, his voice cracking. "You're the one doing this." The figure didn't speak, but its presence filled the space, its intent pressing against his mind like a vice. Suddenly, the symbols on the platform began to glow, forming a massive spiral beneath his feet. The void at its center yawned open, a black hole that seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality. Evan stumbled back, his hands outstretched. "No! I don't want this." The whisper became deafening, the words pounding in his skull. "You were chosen, there is no escape, you are the harbinger." The shadowed figure raised a hand, and Evan felt his body lurch forward against his will. He teetered on the edge of the spiral, his feet skidding against the slick surface. "What does that mean?" he screamed. "Why me?" The figure finally spoke, its voice a guttural roar that reverberated through the structure. "Because you called us." Evan's mind flashed back to the elevator, the strange symbols, the flickering lights, the whisper that had begun so faintly, growing louder with every floor. He had been curious, frustrated, desperate to fix it. But his attempts to fix the elevator had been something else entirely, a summoning. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. He had done this. The figure stepped closer, its form towering over him. With a single, fluid motion, it gestured toward the void. "You will take our place," it said. "The descent must continue." Evan tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. The spiral beneath him glowed brighter, and the void expanded, swallowing the edges of the platform. As he was dragged forward, he saw the figures from before reappear, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They were no longer watching passively, they were waiting. "No!" Evan screamed as the void consumed him, its darkness absolute. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the familiar ding of an elevator arriving at its floor echoed in the darkness. Evan opened his eyes to find himself standing in a pristine elevator. The walls were clean, the buttons glowing softly. But something was wrong. He looked down at his hands, now pale and skeletal. His reflection in the elevator doors stared back at him, hollow-eyed and grinning. The elevator began to move, descending endlessly, and Evan understood. He wasn't the passenger anymore. He was the guide. The elevator hummed softly, its polished metal interior reflecting an uncanny sense of serenity. Evan stood perfectly still, his once familiar body now alien to him. His hollow eyes stared out from a gaunt, skeletal face, and his hands, those long, spindly fingers, hung limply at his sides. The faint whisper, ever present, now resided comfortably in his mind. It no longer sounded intrusive. Instead, it felt like his own voice, guiding him with an unshakable clarity. The elevator descended, faster than it ever had before. The symbols on the control panel shifted and swirled, forming a language he now understood instinctively. He reached out, pressing one of the glowing buttons. It wasn't labeled by a number or floor, just a single, shifting glyph that pulsed faintly beneath his touch. The elevator slowed to a stop, and the doors opened with a soft whoosh. Beyond them was a small, dimly lit office, its walls lined with old file cabinets and stacks of paper. A desk sat at the center, cluttered with documents and a single, flickering desk lamp. A man sat slumped in a chair behind the desk, his face buried in his hands. He looked up as the elevator opened, his tired eyes meeting Evan's hollow gaze. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice weary. Evan tilted his head, an eerie sense of déjà vu creeping over him. The man's face was unfamiliar, but his desperation, his exhaustion, it was all too familiar. Evan had felt it himself not long ago, when he'd first stepped into the elevator on that fateful night. "You've been chosen," Evan said, his voice low and rasping, as though the words came from a great distance. The man frowned, rising slowly to his feet. "Chosen for what? What is this place?" Evan didn't answer. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the elevator. The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though searching for another way out. "There's no escape," Evan said, the words escaping his lips before he realized he was saying them. The man stepped into the elevator, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. Evan followed, the doors closing behind them with a soft clang. The man pressed the button for the ground floor, but the elevator didn't respond. Instead, the symbols on the control panel began to glow, shifting into patterns that Evan now recognized as coordinates. "What's happening?" the man asked, panic creeping into his voice. Evan turned to him, his hollow eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. "The descent," he said simply. The elevator shuddered, lurching into motion. The man stumbled, gripping the railing for support. Through the narrow window in the door, the floors outside began to blur, morphing into twisted, alien landscapes. "Stop it," the man shouted, pounding on the control panel. "Let me out." But there was no stopping it. Evan watched silently, the whisper in his mind growing louder as the elevator plunged deeper and deeper into the unknown. He could feel the pull of the void, the ever-hungry spiral waiting below. "You'll understand soon enough," Evan murmured. The man turned to him, his face pale and stricken with fear. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The void would teach this man, just as it had taught him. The cycle would continue, unbroken, endless. As the elevator descended, Evan turned his gaze to the shifting symbols on the control panel. For the first time since his transformation, he felt a strange sense of peace. He no longer fought against the whisper. He no longer feared the spiral. He had become part of it. And the descent would never end.